And to start with, the most important thing that we do as behavior analysts is follow the code. There is a professional ethical compliance code for behavior analysts that we use in behavior analysis. And the BACB puts out this document. You can get it off the board site. They also have the 4th edition task list, which is much more extensive than the RBT task list. And those two documents are what BCABAs, BCBAs read and you study to get to the board exam as far as the academic requirement and as well as the work they do in the field. A couple of other books that go along with it, supportive, is a book called Ethics for Behavior Analysts by John Bailey and Mary Birch, and a company book they have called 25 Essential Skills and Strategies for Professional Behavior Analysts. And most of the courses that teach this program as a standalone ethics course use those books. I don't get a commission off them, I just use them myself, and it turns out John Bailey was also at KU, but he was there before I was there. But the main point I'm trying to make is the most important thing we can do is be ethical and professional. And in a nutshell, one of the articles out of JAVA, which is the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, is about the client has the right to effective treatment, which is the right to a therapeutic environment, the right to services whose overriding goal is their personal welfare, a right to treatment by a competent behavior analyst, a right to a program that teaches them functional skills, an individual has a right to behavioral assessment, ongoing evaluation, an individual has the right to the most effective treatment procedures. And those 6 points basically drive what was put in the article years ago as the right to effective treatment. The client also has the right to refuse treatment. Now, most of our cases, the parents are speaking for the child, because if you ask the child, do you want me to come in and work with you today? Do you want me to go home? They'll say, go home, get out of here. If they could, they'd say, get out of here. But the parents usually give that consent. And this involves also understanding informed consent, which again, in our cases, the parent gives it. But just to know that informed consent involves that the individual has to have the capacity to make a relevant decision. They have to have the information, which is the details that affects their behavior and the side effects. They also have to volunteer, have voluntariness. They agree to the goal that we're working on, the treatment of the procedures. And again, that's part of the field. That's part of informed consent. So overall, the point I want to make is that we want to focus on solving problems, health and safety, have priorities, medical and physical considerations are involved, collaboration on clear behavioral goals. We want to work on improving the level of independent skills. We want to use client-based preferences, decisions that favor the client. Our procedures need to be socially validated for procedures and our treatment and our outcome. We try to use the least intrusive measures, least intrusive procedures, and we want to use an intact support system for the long-term benefit of our client. The whole point is we're always looking out for the client. Clients come first. Now, to get into behavior analysis, which basically is the science of behavior, we need to know a little bit about science and a little bit about behavior. Actually, a lot about behavior, but a little bit about science. And science has 3 levels. And science is a philosophy that says if we can understand how things work, we can make things better. And we know that, for example, with physics and chemistry and biology and behavior, those are all natural sciences. With physics, we've learned that we can make planes fly and cars go. In chemistry, we learn we can produce chemicals to help people solve health issues. In biology, we learn how to have healthier interaction with the environment and the foods we eat for biology. And we learn about how powerful the environment is when it comes to affecting behavior. So with behavior, particularly, we're looking at what's the natural science of behavior, how does behavior occur naturally in the world, and we see those processes of reinforcement and extinction and punishment. We see shaping and change. We see a lot of these processes in natural acquisition of behavior, whether it's acquisition of a good behavior or problem behavior, and we then copy those principles and we turn them into procedures. So we have reinforcement as a natural process that strengthens behavior or maintains, and we use procedures to try to promote behavior, get a behavior to happen under a certain environmental condition, and we try to reinforce it, to use a procedure to get it into the behavioral repertoire. Now, to understand science and behavior, how they come together, there are some philosophical premises. And the first 9 items on the 4th edition task list are critical to the foundation of thinking how to use science premises for evidence-based science and how it ties into behavior. And those come down to lawfulness of behavior. We know a tremendous more about behavior than we did decades ago. A lot of laws of behavior. The idea of reinforcement is that when a behavior occurs in the environment and that environment changes favorably for the client, they're going to do more of that behavior. It's called reinforcement. That behavior either gets them access to something, like a person, place, or thing, and they get positively reinforced, or that my behavior might be effective, and then get them to avoid or escape a person, place, or thing, which is negative reinforcement. But either way, it gets reinforced because it serves them at that time. The second one is Inflection Ism, and these isms are just philosophies, but they're a way of thinking. It's a set of premises. Inflection Ism says behavior comes from our phylogenetic development, ontogenic development, which means the genes of our species, which have survival value, the things we're programmed to be able to do, and the individual development of the genes from our parents, and the way we interact in our environments tied into our culture. Our culture is our environment, and people in different cultures, different environments learn different behaviors, but we're all still linked to the genes of our species. So behavior comes from the interaction of our genetic endowment with our environments. Determinism is a philosophy basically that says things happen for a reason. And so we think something determined that. It's not always 100% cause effect, but there are factors that are influencing. Empiricism for science says we have to be able to detect what we're measuring, what we're talking about, and measure it so we can tell if it's changing. And because we're sentient beings, we have these senses. We have the 5 main senses: to hear, see, taste, taste, the 5 basic senses. And those sense receptors detect things. We have a lot of other receptors as well. And that means we can see behavior, measure behavior, how long it takes, how many times it occurs, the rate, frequency, inner response time. We have a lot of way to measure behavior. That makes it empirical. Parsimony for science says the simplest explanation that explains the phenomena under study is the one to go with, because the simpler it is, the more variables we can account for. If it's a lot of variables, a lot of times we overanalyze. It's analysis paralysis. Pragmatism is a premise that we use in science and in behavior, that it should be pragmatic. It should make sense. It needs to be practical. If you're going to explain a phenomena, in our case, behavior in the environment, it needs to make sense. That we try to explain the concept of reinforcement, we have to be able to hear it, see it, understand it, and realize, yes, I see how this situation has reinforced that behavior. Another foundational concept is the environmental versus mentalistic explanations. And this is critical for us because typically we've grown up with a lot of psychology talk and classes around us, and we've learned to look at behavior as a product of the mind. And that model would be dualism, thinking that the mind tells the body what to do, and that goes back to the early Greeks. But, with behavior analysis, since the mind is not an empirical thing, we can't measure the mind. It's not an actual physical thing like a science. The mind is a metaphysical concept. So rather than using the mind and saying, well, he did that because he was upset, he was angry, we're going to have to turn that into environmental conditions. He probably was angry and upset, but there was something in the environment that made him angry or upset. Or he did that because he was hungry. Well, if he hasn't eaten food, he's food deprived, which will affect his behavior. So we have to take everyday language like anxiety and figure how do we turn that into a behavioral analytic model and explain what in the environment set off the anxiety, what's the anxiety behavior look like, how do we measure it, and what are the consequences when you engage in anxiety behavior. And then we manipulate antecedent variables and consequences to help that person manage or control that emotional feeling, which has been called anxiety. The other part of that then is, of course, that we're going to use environmental variables, and I'll get to those in another poster in a moment. The next philosophy is that of behaviorism, and behaviorism, like science, behaviorism is a philosophy that says if we can understand how behavior works, we can make things better. So the definition for behavior is basically anything you do, and we've distinguished between radical behaviorism, which says anything we do is behavior, and it's been learned because of our environmental interactions and the consequences of those interactions. And there's methodological behaviorism, which says we're going to study the science based on what we can actually measure. So a lot of our behaviors are covert or unobservable. They're what we call private behaviors within the skin. If you haven't eaten food, you're going to be feeling hungry. That's a physiological reflex. We can't really always measure that. We don't see it, but we do see the behavior of seeking food or eating food. And another thing that's hard to understand is that behavior involves, as I said, anything you do. So this includes, for radical behaviorism, it's a philosophy that if you that thinking, let me just go straight to it. Thinking is something you do. Thinking is a behavior. Thinking is not a mental process, because we're not going to use the mind or mentalistic labels. We're going to say, when I think, that's me thinking. I don't say, in my mind I was thinking, because I don't need to use mind as an extra term. It's not parsimonious. If I say mind, I'm attributing the agent of control, the locus of control, to some other entity, to this thing called a mind, which again is just a metaphysical concept. It's not an actual thing. But what actually is actual is me. I'm the one that thinks. I'm the one that remembers. I'm the one that understands. So it's in my understanding, in my thinking, in my memory, in my remembering, those are behaviors, but they're considered private behaviors. So we can't do the methodological research on those because we can't measure what you're thinking, but we can learn, we can look at thinking as an acquired behavior that's been affected by your reinforcers and punishers. When you think a certain way and behave a certain way, you get reinforced one way or the other. The last part is going to be the domain of behavior analysis. The domain of behaviorism, I should say, is we have the conceptual analysis of behavior, how we talk about these concepts. We have experimental analysis of behavior, which is in the lab, so we've done methodological research and manipulated variables and seen the effects of we've seen the principles emerge from rats and pigeons and monkeys, and we've seen a lot of experimental data that shows us how the principles work. The question becomes, can you use these principles of behavior from labs, and can you apply those to non-humans? I'm sorry, to humans. We'd use the non-humans, animals. Now we're going to say, can we apply those to humans? And so that becomes applied behavior analysis. So we have conceptual analysis of behavior, which is what I'm doing tonight, talking about the concepts. Experimental analysis, which reveals the principles of reinforcement, punishment, extinction, etc. And applied behavior analysis, which is applying those principles to change socially significant behavior. And what we do with all of this information is we then go into what we do in our field is behavioral service delivery. We tend to do behavioral services. We deliver those in the home, in the school, in the community, in clinics. And so we take this science of behavior and what we know about it, and we go in to solve problems. And with that, I want to go to the second poster. And I want to tie the 7 dimensions of what ABA is and compare with what it isn't. So this poster is one that I built. You can see I just printed some huge fonts and cut paper up and taped it on this board. And this is important, so I want to really stress this. In the current dimensions of applied behavior analysis, in 1968, they asked Don Bayer and Mont Wolf and Todd Risley to write an article to say, what is this applied behavior analysis? We had experimental analysis of behavior from a journal, JAB, Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior, but we didn't really have a place to publish research on helping people solve social problems. It was all experimental. So they said, well, we need a journal where we can actually apply these principles to solve socially significant problems, which raised an interesting question. Well, what makes it socially significant? And here's what they came up with. They said, well, at this time, when the field was launching, there are roughly 7 areas, 7 dimensions, 7 characteristics, 7 components of what you might call a behavior program, and it's ABA. And Israel Golddiamond, who'd been in the field for a lot of years, basically says it this way. When you have a behavior problem, you need a behavior program. So these 7 dimensions basically make up what we do as behavior analysts with our programs to help clients have better lives, improve the quality of their lives. And those 7 dimensions are that ABA is applied, it's behavioral, it's analytic, it's technological, it's conceptually systematic, it's effective, and it has generality. Now, in my chart, I've drawn a graph that I show one line with a red line that's a high rate of behavior, like a baseline, and then I draw the treatment line. And then I draw a line, a data path decelerating going down. And that would be a case where there's a behavior that's happening at a high rate, and it's a problem behavior. And what we know how to do is how to make that go down. It means if it's that high, it's a problem, we've got to solve it. And it's getting too much reinforcement. And we know how to use extinction and redirection and reinforce other behaviors so the problem behavior doesn't get reinforced as much. And we know how to lower that and solve problems when there's too much behavior. The other side of that is when there's not enough behavior, skills are missing, independence or communication, we know how to take that term, that concept, how to define it, how to write a task analysis, how to build a behavior treatment plan, how to do shaping and chaining and prompting, and acquire skills and get those behaviors in the client's repertoire. So typically there's either too much behavior or not enough. And with our methodology and our techniques, our principles, we know how to make more behavior, how to make less behavior. So what that ties to in the second column, when we say it's applied, we mean it applies to socially significant behaviors, not lab questions. This is in real life. What is socially significant to the client, to the parent, to the child, to the teacher, to the community? And behavioral means that we're going to take the behavior that we're talking about, we're going to define it operationally, and we're going to measure empirically. So if someone talked about anxiety, we'd say that anxiety is not an actual behavior. Anxiety is not actually a stimulus, a response, a consequence, or a function. Anxiety is a psychological label for an emotional state. If someone is anxious, they're feeling something. If they're upset, angry, happy, sad. Those are all psychological labels for emotions, and those emotions are actually behaviors. So we define them with behaviorals by operation defining them. I'll explain more on that in the next poster. Third, applied ABA is an analytic. An analytic means we look for the function of the behavior. Behavior typically functions by reinforcement or punishment. Reinforcement makes more, punishment makes less. And in the absence of reinforcement, for a previously reinforced behavior, we talk about extinction as a natural principle, a natural process. Behavior that was reinforced and is no longer reinforced will eventually thin down and starve and reduce in frequency because it's not being reinforced. So we look at how behavior functions, and if it's happening, it's some kind of reinforcement. Any ongoing behavior has some reinforcing properties somewhere in the environment. That's why the behavior is happening. It works for that person at that time. The next component of this behavior analysis is technological. And by that, we don't mean computer technology. We mean that it's a technology of teaching, a technology of behavior change. It's a replicable behavior plan. We have someone assess the child, look at the data, identify the function, then we build a behavior plan, a treatment plan based on the function. If we know a child's doing a certain thing for attention, and it's a problem behavior like tantruming or attacking, getting aggressive, we replace that behavior with acceptable behaviors. So we need to write a treatment plan, and then we need to get the BI to do it, the RBT to do it, the teacher to do it, the parent to do it, the clinicians to do it. We need a technology, a program that will work for several people to help that client learn the appropriate behaviors and stop reinforcing problem behaviors, find a way to reinforce better acceptable, socially significant, socially acceptable behaviors with a technological plan. Kind of like it's not like a cookbook, but at least it's like a recipe, so to speak. And that recipe, as you all know, has to be done individually for every single person, even though there's common ground in it. The next thing is behavior analysis is conceptually systematic, which means we're going to use the principles of behavior systematically. So when I look at the graph and I see that high baseline of a red line, I know that conceptually that behavior is getting too much reinforcement. So what I want to do when I use my principles of behavior, my behavior plan, is I want to find a way to not reinforce that behavior because it's already too strong. If I was trying to get that up to mastery, it's already mastered. So when I use my concept systematically, if I want more, I use reinforcement. If I want less, I don't use reinforcement. I reinforce something else, and I put that behavior on extinction and try my best to arrange for no reinforcement for that behavior systematically. And I need that done by everybody on the treatment team. The next component is effective. That an ABA program needs to be effective. Effective means it has to solve the socially significant problem. Effective means it has to be clinically significant, that we've actually improved the child's life with their skills. We taught them communication. We taught them independence, feed, toilet, dress themselves. We taught them to read or write, to learn. We've taught them to have social skills necessary to survive in a social environment. So effective means we're going to look at the data we collected when we first measured the baseline. Now we got the treatment. We're going to look at the data after the treatment and see, does the data demonstrate that we're moving behavior in the right direction, more or less behavior. And the seventh component is a good program should have generality. Generality means that behavior training program will generalize to other behaviors for the client, to other people, to other settings, like I said, from home to school to community. So ABA applies to solving socially significant behaviors. It's behavioral because we find it and measure it. It's analytic because we look at the function. It's technological because when we know the function, we build a treatment plan, try to address the function. It's systematic because we're going to be consistent with how we reinforce and not reinforce. It's effective by following the data. If it's going up and we didn't want to go up, we know we have to change that behavior plan. And it has generality, so it will work in more than one situation. We need to work for that client in other phases of their life, other locations, and other behaviors. Now, on the 4th edition task list, there is a section called CCRs, which is the client-centered responsibilities. And this is basically what we do with our behavioral service delivery. First thing we do is identify the problem. We then go into measurement of that problem in that setting, in those situations. We then assess that behavior. We then build our intervention, and then we implement, manage, and supervise that implementation. And what I want to point out to you here, when you look at this chart, you see in the far left column, applied goes directly across the line to associative behaviors where you identify the problem. And behavioral is operation defined, which is the part of measurement. The analytic part is we analyze for function, which is why we do the assessments. We do an ABC analysis to assess the behavior. We do a functional behavior analysis to hypothesize the function. We can do a functional analysis assessment and manipulate variables to test for the actual reinforcing function for that behavior. The technological is the intervention, that's the behavior plan. And then when we use our concepts systematically and follow the data and generalize, program for maintenance and generalization, we are indeed implementing the function-based treatment plan based on the data from the baseline of the identified problem. We implement, we manage, and supervise that behavior plan. So there is a nice correlation, a nice lineup across this chart of what the 7 dimensions are and how they apply to the work we do. Now, the last column is basically the third column translated into everyday terms. One of the things it tells us in the CCRs is, under the, by the way, identification of the problem is category G, measurements H, assessment I, intervention J, implementation K. So with G01, it says you have to identify the problem. And you need to look at the records review and see what we already know about the child. Look at their medical records or behavioral treatment records. We also have to look for medical or biological issues. We have to then do some kind of assessment so we can know what the behavior is. But if I tell a parent I'm going to do ABA on associative behaviors, identification of the problem, they're not really going to be that interested. What I have to go to the parent, and this is G04, it says, talk about this in terms of real life problems. So when I worked in a lot of homes with a lot of parents, I did a lot of parent education and coaching. I basically said, I'm here to do ABA. I'm here to help solve your real life problems. Tell me what the problems are that your child's having. And a lot of times it was communication. Maybe it was too much tantruming, or maybe too much stalling, or maybe he wouldn't cooperate. So I would have to take those terms that were their everyday labels and turn those into operational definitions. And then I need to get some kind of measurement of how much they happened. So instead of saying I need a frequency measure, a duration measure, I need an IRT, I want you to use latency measures, I just say to the parent, here's a piece of paper for the refrigerator, here's a magnet. What we're going to do is talk about how many times he did it. So we're going to write stalling, a tantrum, and we're going to just have you make a mark, like a tally, each time he does it. From that, I can derive my own frequency measures. And if I tell him, okay, when he starts the tantrum, write down the time he starts, write down the time he stops. And that'll give me a duration measure. And by writing when and where it stops, I have a location and time, so I know whether it's happening in the morning or happening in the afternoon or happening at bedtime. And that gives me some preliminary data. And that's something parents can do, is keep track of how many times it happens, how long or when, as opposed to IRT measures or latency measures, the other terms that we do for our field work. The next one with the parent, instead of saying I need to be analytic and assess for the function, I need to say I need to figure out why it happens. For example, we've noticed he tantrums for attention. So that's a function. Or he tantrums to get access to the iPad. Or he tantrums to get out of the homework. So that's the why it happens. And when I know why it happens, I can use that motivation, because that's functional for the child, and figure out how to build a plan that's going to work with that. So then again, I don't tell them I'm going to build a technological replicable behavior plan for the intervention. I say, here's what I want to give you. I want to write a doable behavior plan for the parents, for the teachers, for the practitioner, for the people that are going to do the actual frontline shaping. And when I say doable, I make the point that I've had supervisors at meetings tell me, I wrote a perfect behavior plan, the parent won't do it. And I say, well, then it wasn't perfect. The perfect plan is the one they will do. And sometimes we get too technical. We want parents to do something that's too technical, too complicated. It's got to be as parsimonious, as simple as possible. It has to be pragmatic, has to make sense. It has to be practical. It has to be something they can actually do. And I would write plans, and parents would say, I can't do that. That's my baby. When he cries, I fall apart. I can't not give it to him. So I say, well, let's talk about what you can do. How can you, if he wants something, how can you get him to give you better behavior than the one you're getting? That way, he still has a contingency, but we're going to have to make it something you can live with. And I don't tell parents to use contingencies. I tell them, here's a simple model. First, do this, then get that. When you do this, then you get that. If he does this, then you do that. So those three, first then, if then, when then, are basically contingency statements. And that helps parents often move to a little plan for a way to state what they need to be able to reinforce it. The next part of being conceptually systematic is simply, with the parent, without getting into reinforcement schedules and differential reinforcement, I say, here's the deal. We know the behavior. We know that either it's a function of attention or escape or access, something he wants. So we need to figure out when to reward and when to not reward. And I give them this idea. When you do good things happen. When you don't do good things don't happen. Now they expect me to say, when you don't do good things, bad things happen. But I said, that's not the logic I want to use. We know that reward will strengthen behavior, and we know that we don't want to reward bad behavior. So when you do good things happen. If he does something you don't want, we just don't reward it. We try to redirect and get him to do something good. Now, as far as being effective, for the parent, that just means it works. When the parent actually tries things, and I actually could coach them and tell them, okay, tell him he needs to say, excuse me, please, and then talk to him and wait for him to do it. And they would see that it worked. He actually learned to wait instead of calling mom, 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 mom. He finally learned to, we taught him how to basically say, excuse me, and interrupt in an appropriate manner rather than repeatedly saying mom or saying, hey, hey, hey. And when they see it actually working, when they've done when the simple rules explained and the kid follows it and tries it, we quickly want to reinforce it. And the parents know it's working. And that's the whole thing to me, was to get parents to try something that was fairly simple, that would actually produce a change they could see that it worked, and then get them to use that at home, school, and in the community. So to get generality, we need it to work everywhere. So this is a simple chart I built on the 7 dimensions. The second column is basically the basic behavior analytic skills and principles in there. The third column is the CCRs, what we do to serve clients. And the fourth column is everyday language. A lot of times parents are asking what you're doing, and it's hard to explain to them what ABA is. But that fourth column is a nice, simple way to say we're here to solve problems. We need to get an idea of how much it happens. We need to figure out why it happens, so we'll know what to do that's doable, that you can do it and I can do it. We want to know what to reward and not reward. We want to watch to see what's working. We want to make sure it works in more than one place so we can get it to work at home, in school, and the community. That's a little more user-friendly to parents. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is lawfulness of behavior. And this is the foundational item number 1 under the foundational knowledge in our field. These are in the task list as well. And just to talk about that for a minute, the idea is that we know a lot about behavior and how it works. We know laws of physics, we know about gravity, laws about sunshine on a plant usually makes it grow better. And as far as behavior, we know a lot about the laws of how consequences affect the function of behavior. Consequences either reinforce and make more behavior and maintain it, or consequences make less, they either punish it. And if there's no consequences, then it's basically like extinction. The behavior happens, it's not reinforced, that behavior goes somewhere else. It goes to where it can find reinforcement. So the idea of lawfulness is we look to see, how do antecedents evoke behavior? How do respondents elicit behavior? What is it that sets off behavior? How does that work in the world of science and behavior and stimuli and consequences? And we look at these models. And on this graph, you'll see on the far right, you'll see first lawfulness of behavior. And there's my formula, which is behavior is a function of the environment, because we're going to use environmental variables, not mentalistic. It's not that there's not, the concept of mind is well established. The mental terms are pretty well understood, but they're not manipulable. So what we're going to do is simply translate those into responses, environments, antecedents, antecedent stimuli, antecedent MOs and antecedent SDs, antecedent stimuli, and consequences, stimuli that occur after behavior, and talk about it that way to make it more of a science and explain how it's lawful. The third chart down shows 4 graph lines, and what those are effects and patterns made by schedules of reinforcement. We know when we use a ratio schedule, like a variable ratio, we get a high rate of sustained responding. When you use a fixed ratio schedule, we get more of what's called a break and run, or a step-like pattern, where they'll respond maybe 5 times, get a reinforcer and take a pause, and then respond again and take a pause. And we know that that fixed ratio schedule produces some reinforcement pauses, and the ratio schedules produce the highest rates of responding. A couple other schedules are going to be the variable interval, when the timing of the behavior reinforcement occurs randomly over time. So it's not how many responses, it's the timing as to when you deliver consequences for behavior. And that produces a fairly steady, sustained rate, not as high and rapid as the variable ratio. And the fourth one shows what looks like little waves. We call those fixed interval scallops. And that's basically the pattern there is that initially there's little to no responding, and the closer you get to the end of the interval, the more rapid the responding. And the first response after that interval is the one that gets reinforced. And then the behavior drops back down to not occurring, then gradually starts to speed up, and then right at the last minute, the first behavior after the time runs out gets reinforced. Now, in everyday life, we call that procrastination. We call it putting it off to the last minute. In our field, we have a term for it. It's called a fixed interval scallop. And below that graph is the same 4 schedules on the left side. On the right side, it shows what happens when you have behavior on those schedules of reinforcement and you stop reinforcing it. And you'll see by looking at those patterns, they continue somewhat the same for a while, but they gradually get flatter and flatter until the behavior just flattens out, is not occurring. And that graph is called a cumulative record. It only goes up, it doesn't go down. So whenever it's going flat, there's no responding. And you'll see the steepness of the curve is the amount of responding. You see the same little patterns. So that's just some of the data that's shown us how behavior is very lawfully related to the delivery of consequences, the timing, etc. In the second column, we get some very critical basic concepts. Behavior is anything you do. And when you study it, we learn that behavior has 3 dimensions. Behavior has repeatability. It happens repeatedly. Behavior has temporal extent. It happens for some amount of time. Temporal is time. And behavior has temporal locus. It occurs at some point in time. So as soon as somebody does something, it occurred, that made a behavior. We can measure the occurrence of behavior like with the frequency count. We also times measure the absence of behavior, the non-occurrence that occurs or doesn't occur. We can measure that. A response is a single instance of behavior, and a response class is all those behaviors that make up that response, that behavior. For example, if the behavior is getting dressed, then the repertoire is to teach dressing behavior. And that's made up of a task analysis of all the steps you go through, all the individual responses to get dressed. Put on underwear, put on a sock, put another sock on, put on your pants, put on your shirt, put on your belt, put on your shoes, put on your coat. So that task analysis of a stimulus response, a chain of behaviors, leads to the response class of now I'm dressed. The function is I'm dressed, I can go outside and play. I'm dressed, I can go to the movie. I'm dressed, I can go to work. So we use those foundational concepts. We use those to get our measurement as well. From the behavior, we get 5 measurable dimensions, which we'll get into another time. The second one is about the environment. And there are environments, both public and private. And then there are stimuli in the environment, and those stimuli make up a class. So if we're teaching someone to get dressed, then each of the items I put on, the sock is a stimulus, the underwear is a stimulus, the pants is a stimulus, and the stimulus class is what we would call wearable items. So when I'm getting dressed, my response class is to respond to and put on clothing that's from a stimulus class of wearable items. And we're very good at looking at response classes and figuring out what the task analysis is and what the stimuli that are involved. If you're setting the table, then of course the knife, fork, spoon, glass, napkins, those are all the stimulus class of table setting. And those then make up the response class of having set the table. So response class is responding to the stimulus class of all those things that go on the table. The next one's about stimulus equivalence. This gets a little headier, where a lot of concepts can take on the same meaning. A lot of pictures, a lot of words, a lot of spelling, all basically refer to the same concept, the same stimulus. And what we know in the science is that once we learn a picture of a dog and a match with a picture of a dog, and then we actually see the letters D-O-G, we can match the picture with the letters D-O-G and discriminate that from C-A-T or C-O-W. And then we can also make the sound dog. And the child begins to learn that the picture is the same as the letters D-O-G, and the letters D-O-G is the same as the sound dog, and the child figures out then that picture is what's called a dog, and that's what we call stimulus equivalence. And this is how we have a tremendous range of stimuli that can be antecedent or consequent stimuli, because they're basically equivalent in their stimulus function. Below that is the labels for those relationships: reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. Again, that's something we drill down in much deeper later. The important part here is going to be this next column. The behavior we work with in behavior analysis is 2 main categories. We talk about respondents and operants. These are the areas of our specialty. Now, in order to understand respondents, we have to understand reflexive relations. So with respect to feelings, emotions, those are the things we feel, and those are our physiological reflexes. An example is that a US, an unconditioned stimulus, will elicit a UR, an unconditioned response, and that's a reflex. The reflex has those 2 components. And so, for example, cold air will give you goosebumps. Hot air will make you sweat. A loud noise, an auditory stimulus, will startle you. So the stimulus is a loud noise. The unconditioned response is a startle response. Now, startle is not a really good definition of the actual behaviors. What typically happens with a loud noise, and these are physiological responses in our body, they're reflexes. A loud noise will elicit heart rate and increased heart rate. It'll startle you. Your heart rate speeds up. Your chest muscles often get tight. Maybe your throat gets dry. Your face might flush. So when you're frightened, scared, sometimes embarrassed, so you'll start feeling these physiological sensations, which are reflexes that are elicited in our body. And we have a ton of reflexes in our body. We've also learned that those reflexes get paired with a variety of other stimuli. So respondent conditioning is a huge thing that we understand how it works. A child sleeping in his room at night hears a box fall over in the closet. He hears the noise. It startles him. His heart speeds up. His chest goes out. He cries out. His parents run in. What's the matter? He says, I'm scared. There's a monster in my closet. And the parents turn the lights on, open the closet door and say, oh, look, there's not a monster. It's just this box fell over and made the noise and scared you. Well, because it was dark and that noise happened, those got paired. And the noise elicited, this means it literally caused that heart rate. A loud noise will actually cause the startle response. That's an involuntary behavior. That's why they're called reflexes. The next night, the parents put the child to bed, and they say, good night, sweetheart. They turn off the light, and all of a sudden, his heart speeds up. He starts to cry. And they say, what was it? There was no noise. Well, we understand how these behaviors work, that feelings, these emotions, these feelings are elicited responses of our physiology, of our body. That darkness got paired with the sound, and now the darkness makes his heart speed up. Anybody that's learned to be afraid of the dark has basically had darkness paired with something in the dark that actually set off these physiological reflexes. In psychology, we use labels, which we call emotional labels, and we spend time teaching children to label. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm frightened, I'm scared, I'm upset, I'm angry. We teach them labels, but those labels are just psychological labels for emotions. And those emotions, this is important, in our field, those emotions are respondents. They are respondent behaviors. They are how we feel. They are feelings. In psychology, I was taught that feelings cause behavior. But in behavior analysis, I learned that feelings don't cause behavior. The environment is what caused that response. And what it is that feelings are behavior. These feelings, what we're feeling. If I'm hot, I sweat. If I'm cold, I get goosebumps. Hear a noise, I get startled. My heart speeds up. I hear news, I get excited. I have all these feelings, and I get all these psychological labels for these emotions. Emotional behaviors is what they are. And since we understand how they work, how conditioning works, we know how to use desensitization, progressive relaxation, habituation to help somebody control those emotional states and how them feel, make them feel better, teach them how to feel better. There's a whole industry in desensitization, relaxation, and taking control of your management of your emotions. And a lot of our clients have a lot of emotional challenges. So we know how to use these techniques. The next to that is the operant conditioning, which is one of our strengths as well, is with operant behaviors, we know there's a stimulus in the environment, and we respond to that environment, and that behavior changes the environment. So if I want to leave my room, I see the stimulus is my door, the doorknob. My response is to turn that handle. Consequences, when I turn and pull, the door opens. Now I get access to another environment. I get reinforced for that. That behavior was emitted. It wasn't a reflex because it wasn't involuntary. We've learned to do, everything we've learned to do are operants. Those behaviors operate on and change the environment. Those behaviors are a function of the environment. The function altering stimuli are consequences. Consequences either reinforce and strengthen behavior and maintain it, or consequences could punish behavior. Now, we typically teach it. Nowadays, it's taught us the ABCs. There's an antecedent condition, could be a motivating operation. If you haven't had anything to drink or eat for a while, you're hungry or you're thirsty. And that's going to motivate you to find the SD where you last got food or drink. And then you're going to use the behavior to eat or drink. And then the consequence is you're no longer hungry. If you want to go somewhere, the motivating operation is I need to leave the house, so I got to get dressed, and then I go out and I get in the car and I drive the car and I get at the store and I buy groceries. So operant behavior is what we're really good with. That's what we analyze, the things that we've learned, and these have been acquired and maintained by consequences. So operant behaviors are emitted and they're voluntary. Respondent behaviors are elicited. This is where the word elicit is exclusively used in our field as this cause to the reflex to the body. And then it causes these body behaviors. And other stimuli get paired up, and they set off the same basic reflex. And the bottom is where it all comes together. We're always feeling something. Our clients are feeling something, happy, tired, scared, bored. We're always feeling something. And those feelings are our respondents, and those are physiological states of often deprivation or satiation, and they affect what we've learned to do. So if I haven't eaten for a while, I'm food deprived, and that motivates me to go find food. And I've learned in the past that food's in the refrigerator in the kitchen, so I'm going to go to the kitchen. The refrigerator has become an SD for getting food or getting drinks. So based on how I'm feeling, which is reflexive on my body, I've learned to do operant, voluntarily learned behaviors. And every day we go through life on a continuous interaction of how we're feeling affects what we're doing. So that column right there is very much about our operants and respondents. And this is the work that you do, is working with behaviors that are very emotionally conditioned and operantly conditioned, and teaching acceptable replacement behaviors so that the child can have successful functioning and be effective in their world. The last column is just some more charts and graphs to sort of demonstrate behavior can be maintained and reinforced or go up, or behavior that was reinforced and behavior that's punished will actually go down. Punishment does have a place. A lot of behaviors get punished naturally. If you're speeding and you get a ticket, the ticket was a signal that you're going to lose some money or your license, and that losing your money, you're paying a fine, is actually going to be a negative reinforcer, a negative punisher, because they took away a reinforcer. They removed something you like, money, or they put you in jail. They removed your freedom. So we know how reinforcement affects behavior and punishment. The next chart is my Srs Function Chart. In the top half, I put the respondents in there, but they don't really have stimulus consequences. Consequences don't affect it. If it gets cold, you're going to get a goosebump. You're going to get goosebumps. Now, you've learned to go put a coat on, so you do what you do was an operant behavior that affects how cold you are, but those are reflexes. The bottom half are the MOs, the SDs, the S deltas, SPs, where we have behavior that we've learned to do under certain situations, which either adds or removes something in the environment, and we get either reinforced or punished. Below that is a chart on matching law. As simple as I can say it, matching law goes something like this. Behavior goes where reinforcement flows. Matching law says you're going to match your behavior to the payoff. And this is common when you see a child doing something, you say, why is he doing that? Well, because it's the most reinforcing thing he knows how to do. It's the easiest thing to do. So anytime someone's doing what they prefer to do, that's typically matching law saying the reinforcer's over here. So I'm going to do the behavior that gets me the most reinforcement for the least amount of effort. And the more effort they put into it tells you how powerful the reinforcing properties are for that activity or that stimulus. The bottom chart is the typical treatment curve where you've got a high baseline, and then you decide that you're going to try to put that on extinction because you decide it's been maintained by attention, for example. So you stop reinforcement, and if you see that little graph, there's a little bit where it jumps up. We call that the extinction burst. A previously reinforced behavior that gets put on extinction will burst. It'll do more behavior. It'll increase in intensity, tantrum louder, tantrum longer, tantrum with more intensity. And then when it doesn't work, it will start to drop down, and you get the actual effect of the treatment. It drops down pretty low, and then it bounces back up a little bit. And that bounce back up, in our field, we refer to as spontaneous recovery. Some fields call that as a rebound effect, and some fields call it resurgence. It's the same basic phenomena, and it's in other fields besides behavior analysis. Then it drops down again, and then you get the actual sustained effect. And the point I make to parents when they say, hey, you can help us, here's a problem behavior, can you make it go away so he never does it again? I say, no, I can't get rid of it forever. It's in the repertoire. He's always going to have it. It can come back anytime. But I'm going to try to stop reinforcing it and reinforce alternative behaviors, acceptable behaviors, and hopefully minimize the occurrence of the problem behavior by using extinction. If we accidentally reinforce it once, we can strengthen it, put it right back in the repertoire, put it right back up to strength. I want to close out with this last chart. I'm just going to touch on it briefly. People that are working towards the board exam have to learn the entire 4th edition task list. What I've done here is I've taken the 7 dimensions, lined them up with the research articles on applied, on the current dimensions and still current dimensions, social validity, and then I've matched up the behavioral with the measurement aspect of the basic behavioral analytic skills. Then I've matched up the analytic part with the experimental design to find the function. Match up the technological part with the behavior change considerations, which includes the details of the behavior plan, which is section D, which is the elements of behavior change. Section D. Section E is section on behavior change procedures, and section F are behavior change systems, such as the token system or self-management systems. The conceptually systematic points to what we call the foundational knowledge items, and those go up to 48. And these are terms and concepts we need to understand. And then effective points to the article called the direct effective treatment, and generality points to this article called Implicit Technology of Generalization, which shows us what research has uncovered about what have been the most effective strategies to generalize behavior. And generality means we're trying to get some stimulus generalization, respond to new stimuli that weren't trained, but they recognize the properties of a stimulus class, or response generalization with new responses that still function the same, even though it's the way to do it, it still helps them be effective across different behaviors, different people, different situations. On the far right column, once again, you'll see the familiar client-centered responsibilities. We identify the problem, we measure it, we assess for function, build an intervention based on function, then we implement, manage, and supervise that behavior plan. So that's a whole lot of information about ABA, what it is, how it works, and tied to behavior analysis. I'm going to pause for just a moment here. I'm going to stop recording.